Hello and welcome everyone to our second TMG conversation. If you're just joining us, please go ahead and mute your microphone. And I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So, Paul, I think we are recording at this point. And so everyone should see my screen. We want to welcome you to this online conversation. This conversation features Gail Anderson and Micah Parzen. In a minute, we'll begin a conversation online in which you can hear directly from both Gail and Micah related to the book Mission Matters, Relevance and Museums in the 21st Century by Gail Anderson, edited by Gail Anderson, excuse me. So we're gonna have this conversation in three parts. One is an introduction and welcome from TMG, the museum group, which has decided to create a series of online conversations related to topics that are relevant for the museum field. And we are honored to feature TMG members who have recently published works that help further work in our field. As we begin this conversation, we will invite Gail to introduce Micah, who is her guest, after she does a brief overview of her book. And then we will invite you all to think about and ask questions to both Gail and Micah as they are in conversation with each other for a few minutes. You'll have some time afterwards to do a brief Q&A. At that point, we will thank you all and then move on to closing out the conversation. So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Gail, who is president of Gail Anderson Associates. She works with museum leaders and workers, facilitating institutional transformation, building institutional and leadership capacity, and expanding community and global relevance. Gail's dedicated much of her time over a 40-year plus career researching and amassing resources that we can share together. These examples from the field contribute to new ideas and evolve the thinking about museums. Gail's projects include strategic planning, organizational restructuring, institutional assessment and development, and board development. She's worked with more than 65 clients and completed over 105 projects. Prior to launching her own consulting business, Anderson was the deputy director of the Mexican Museum, vice president of Museum Management Consultants, chair of the Graduate Department of Museum Studies at John F. Kennedy University in Berkeley, California, and assistant director at the Southeast Museum in Los Angeles, and a museum educator at the Museum of Northern Arizona. We are delighted that Gail is helping us shape this conversation, the second conversation of the TMG webcast series, and we welcome you all to listen as she gives us an introduction to her newest work and presents Micah Parzen, who we are also delighted to have join us today.
Thank you. Maybe the next slide would be excellent, Janeen. First of all, I want to just say thank you for those of you that have are joining us. I very much look forward to the Q&A toward the end. I will try to keep my comments very focused, which is hard, of course, when you have a whole book dealing with the complexities of missions, but I will do my best. So when we were putting this together, Janeen asked, why this book? Well, I would say it probably comes down to several things. First of all, the first edition was 20 years ago. All right, too old, needs to be updated. Second, I continue to have concern that the understanding of the power of the mission has still not been widely understood, not understood how it is can be a constructive tool for coalescing an institution and then making it relevant. So that would remain a concern of mine. And then the confluence of issues from environmental stress to all the multiple voices that need to be heard in our communities, not only here in the US, but around the world, continue to not be represented in many institutions, which then still gets back to the mission. How is the mission all-encompassing? And then finally, I wanted to create something that would be useful to leaders so that their guidelines in it and pieces that can be used to help instigate change. So next. So the structure of the book probably falls into about 3 areas. One, there is a backdrop of framing the issues at hand, framing why mission is important. There are 22 different perspectives from museum leaders who have changed and shifted their institution based on mission. And there are a lot of practical tools that I referenced moments ago, not to mention 80 mission statements from around the world. Okay, next. Next. Okay, you knew this was coming. I have to talk about what is a relevant mission. It has to explain why the museum exists, how it makes a difference, and how it impacts the future. Should be short, memorable inspiration. It's basically the compass for the institution. However, sorry to report that having looked at probably 400 mission statements in preparation for this publication, many are still descriptive, listing the things that they do, or they seem to be completely inwardly focused and not relational to the environment and their communities, and exclusionary. So that additionally fueled my desire to do this book. Next. All right, this particular graphic featured on the cover of the book is central to the way I framed the book. You will note that around the edges, contemporary issues and realities and local communities and context mean that a museum leadership needs to be very mindful and look at what those external issues are, and then assess what the capacity is of their institution to make a difference and have a rightful spot in joining and leading change. The 4 areas represent the aspects within the institution that then need to be adjusted so that they enable that mission to be accomplished. So under institutional capacity, let's talk budget for a minute. So if you have a particular budget and you're shifting the focus of your mission, then I would expect or anticipate seeing altered priorities in the budget to support that mission. Leadership in that quadrant is a place to reference what kind of leadership reflects the community that's being served. That goes to the board, the staff, volunteers, and what is the initiative to change that. Public engagement alignment would of course lead to maybe some of the activities an institution is doing would be discontinued so that there could be room to add meaningful conversations and activities that support the mission that are relevant to the community. And last, interpretive strategies includes things such as collections, which is by virtue of what you collect and you use through your research and display and otherwise, if again you are shifting the focus of the institution, then I would expect that ripple effect through the collections. And also interpretive strategies relates to multiple voices. So for me, I have observed redos of mission, but not necessarily a complete holistic rethinking of the institution and how it will support a more relevant institution. Okay, next. So in preparing and doing the research for this, and as we collected mission statements to be included, I was inspired by Elaine Mangurian's piece, I think it was 2003, where she really reframed how we think about museums by type. We took that work and then took it another step, and all of the mission statements are grouped under these 4 areas: community building, content-centered, experience-focused, issues-based. Why? To have a discipline-defined institution is problematic. The way the world is, the interrelationship of everything from how we live as human beings and how we interact with others. We don't just walk down one singular path that might be denoted by an academic discipline, which really is, 19th century based. And so I deliberately refocus that. So when you look at the mission statements in the book, these are probably a leading characteristic for an institution would define where a mission statement would be placed. Okay, next. Just going to go through a few examples and then we'll get to hear from Micah. The Oakland Museum of California, their mission statement is about really creating a more vibrant future for Californians and their communities. To that end, they have programs that support that. They have exhibitions that relate to that. They've had exhibitions around voices of members of the community. They did one on the evolution of our thinking around use of marijuana. These are things very germane and relevant to Californians and beyond, but that is their compass, their guiding principle there. Okay, next. Next. The Arizona Sonora Desert, what I like about this one is it's not just identifying plants and animals indigenous to the Arizona Sonora Desert, but it's really talking about how do people live in harmony. That is getting at a longer-term impact, and it is hopefully creating citizens who will be responsive and responsible for caring for the environment. Okay, next. This may be one of my favorites. This is Minneapolis Science Museum. Basically, turn on the science, fine, but inspire learning, inform policy, improve lives. Nice alliteration. But it takes you right through a kind of a process, learning, policy, and then change that improves lives. That is about making a difference. That is about impacting the future. Okay, next. The National Building Museum is an interesting one, excuse me, in that they could have an institution that traces different architectural styles and be very based on concrete examples. But if you notice, it's talking about how does the quality of the built environment help people understand how that impacts their lives. I mean, that is very forward looking, and that turns what could be kind of a standard way of presenting content into something that has results. And next. In doing work around the globe, that is through the internet, wish I had been able to travel, but anyway, there are quite a few institutions that are addressing collective memory and tragedy in their respective nations or communities. There are examples in the book from India, Poland, trying to remember right off the top of my head, New Zealand. And basically, it's really addressing the tragedy and the stress on a national community as a result of violence. And so they are making an effort to address it through their work. This is a new museum. It'll be opening shortly. There's another one in Columbia that has opened, but I elected to feature this one. I had a chance to be in communication with the architect for it. And next. So I think I did all right on my time. I'm pretty darn excited. So my colleague, Micah, not only is he featured in the book because of the transformation that's occurred at the San Diego Museum of Man, I've had the privilege of working with him, and I know the power of his leadership. But to talk a little bit about Micah, what I loved about his bio was that first he identified himself husband, father, where he studied, but very much a human-centered sense of self-identity, which I really liked, Micah. So Micah has a PhD from Case Western Reserve University. He has a BA from Berkeley, and he has a law degree from UC Davis. So he brings a lot of diverse perspective. What was really exciting about Micah's journey to becoming the CEO of the San Diego Museum of Man was the fact that he was on the board. He stepped off the board and was elected to be CEO. And as he says, quote, "Having never worked a day in a museum, the learning curve was steep and humbling." And so Micah surrounded himself with forward-looking staff members and board, and over the last 8 years has taken a very traditional institution into something very connected to contemporary issues today. So Micah, I'm going to let you take it from there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gail. And hi, everybody. It's really a pleasure not just to be featured in the book and in terms of the transformation that's occurred at the museum, but also to be here today with all of you. I'm a huge fan of TMG and all the gurus that comprise it. And so it's really an honor to be able to share some of our story today. Gail, in fact, was absolutely instrumental in the transformational journey that we have been on over the last several years. When I first joined the museum in 2010, having never worked a day in a museum, but knowing that we really wanted to reimagine what this institution was, I came upon Gail's book, Reimagining the Museum, and I thought, well, that's what we want to do. So I'm going to hire her to help lead us through a strategic planning process. And that was exactly what she did, and became a wonderful mentor to me, and really helped us kind of go to the edge of the cliff and jump off into this brave new space. I wanted to give just a little bit of background context on the Museum of Man for those of you who may not be familiar with us. We were founded in 1915 as part of the Panama, California Exposition that was celebrating the opening of the Panama Canal and trying to put San Diego on the map. The idea was that we would sort of be one of the great museums of the Southwest, akin to, say the Heard or the Maxwell, and very much had sort of a traditional anthropological purview. Many exhibits about pots and rugs and baskets and the like. We've always been a little bit unique in that, unlike the vast majority and virtually every other anthropology museum that I'm familiar with, we are not under the rubric of an academic institution, nor are we sort of subsumed and reduced to a taxonomical classification under a natural history museum. And while that has pros and cons associated with it, it very much kind of sets us up to be a little more experimental and more of a public anthropology kind of museum. Many years ago, particularly in the 70s and 80s and 90s, the museum had really captured the imagination of the public and was sort of an it museum in this community, but gradually lost its way in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it had lost its relevance to the community. And along with that, its financial viability went down the tubes, and it was in significant distress by the time that I arrived in 2010. And although there were all sorts of challenges and problems, I had one thing going for me, and I think that there was a real sense of urgency that something needed to change, and that this institution had to reformulate itself and reimagine itself. So we went down a year-long strategic planning process, and the slide you see before you is the fruit of that labor, at least probably for me, the single most important thing that we did in that process of trying to figure out who we were and what we stood for as an institution going forward. And we came up with this new mission, which I believe is just 7 words, and replaced a very old, outdated, collect, preserve, interpret, blah, blah, blah type of mission that many museums still have today. And this shift in direction was quite a radical one, to inspiring human connections by exploring the human experience, and really works in tandem with our vision of being San Diego's dynamic place to go to learn from each other, reflect on our place in the world, and build a better community. So a very different sort of springboard and platform to how we're going to engage the community going forward. And, you know, I really came in at a perfect storm at the right moment, where the board didn't know what it needed and what it wanted. They weren't really anthropologists. They didn't really understand museums. It was sort of that old school board that so many of us are so familiar with. And I was able to sort of, in that moment of urgency, kind of help shift the organization in this different kind of direction. And it created a phenomenal platform for us to offer a completely different set of products than we had ever offered in the past. So we shifted from the familiar exhibits about pots and baskets and rugs to exhibits that were really relevant to the guy and the gal on the street, and to our base of visitors, who largely tourists here in San Diego, but also many residents, depending on the season. We started to do exhibits about subjects like beerology, about the history of beer across time and cultures, with a whole slew of public programs that brought in new demographics. We did exhibits on living with animals and how we can do that better as individuals and as a collective. We did an exhibit called Accessibility from the Boston Children's Museum about how children navigate the world with disabilities in very meaningful ways. We did human rights exhibits about torture, about empowering women and cooperatives that are really creating a ripple effect. We did Ramp It Up from the Smithsonian, skateboard culture and skateboarding Native American culture, and actually built a half pipe in the museum itself. We've done Cannibals, Myth and Reality. And of course, we have Race, Are We So Different? And purchased one of those. From the Science Museum of Minnesota, we've got the small version, and it has been a critical part of our evolution and our journey as an institution. Once we started to offer these kinds of different products, things really began to change. Our philanthropic supporters started to rally around us as an institution, understanding who we were and what we stood for going forward. Our admissions skyrocketed. We went from about $600,000 in admissions revenues to now we're at about 2.4 million. So we've quadrupled that over the last several years. And most importantly, of course, we've made an enormous impact on our visitors in all sorts of ways, and we can certainly talk about that later. We've grown the institution from 28 employees when I first arrived to about 65 now on a good day. And our budget has grown from 2.1 million to over 4.3 million at this juncture. If we could have the next slide, that'd be great. Over time, we were really able to kind of articulate a much deeper iteration and understanding of what we mean by our mission and vision. And we came up with this model that we called our transformative impact model, or model for transformation. And you can see that the mission and vision are really emerging out of what we came to articulate as an energy source of love. We started moving away from the idea that we were even an anthropology museum and that people's eyes glaze over when we hear that, and more talking about us being inspired by anthropological values. So when we say that, we mean things like sitting in generosity and not in judgment, walking a mile in another's shoes, compassion for all humanity. And that really has become our energy source going forward. We've realized that our sweet spot is sort of creating and holding a space of discourse for meaningful conversations about topics that really matter. And we try to do that in ways that are both fun, knowing that people come to museums to enjoy themselves, to be with friends, to laugh, to enjoy family, but we're not Disneyland or SeaWorld or Legoland. People are also looking for something much more meaningful and profound from us as institutions. We also came up with a 7-step visitor's journey that really encapsulates everything we want folks to experience when they encounter one of our exhibits and engage with it, or they go through a public program of some kind. And it really starts with that hook that draws them in. And then there's a process really of challenging one's assumptions and hopefully even imbalancing somebody, sometimes making them uncomfortable, which we hope will create an opening for them to incorporate new information into their worldview and continue down their journey. Next, please. We realized early on that if we wanted to create and hold a space of meaningful discourse externally for our visitors, that we were not going to be able to do that in an authentic and a successful way if we weren't already creating and holding that kind of space internally as an institution. And drawing from Mother Teresa and this quote here that if you want to change the world, go home and love your family. Next, please. We started an initiative that we called World Peace Starts at Home. And that initiative was really about aligning who we said we were externally to who we actually were internally, and really making a concerted effort to walking the talk in that respect in a really authentic and sincere way. And it caused us to do a lot of soul searching about who we are as an organization, a lot of looking in the mirror and under the hood. We asked a lot of questions about, as a staff, how we treat each other and relate to one another, how we treat each other and relate to one another as a board, and how the board and the staff treat and relate to one another, and really breaking down those traditional barriers between the haves and the have-nots across the organization. And lastly, but perhaps most significantly, it really led us down a journey of self-reflection in terms of how we treat and relate to the descendant communities of the ancestors and the cultural patrimony that we hold and have been entrusted to steward. Next slide, please. That has led us to a major initiative at the museum that we call Decolonizing the Museum. And obviously it's a catchphrase and a buzzword today that many of you are familiar with. We've been going down the path now for about 3 to 4 years. And for us, this is really about coming to terms with that colonial paradigm that museums emerged out of, and this idea that to the victor go the spoils, and that somehow because white people are better than people of color and Native and Indigenous peoples, they have a right to take all their stuff and then become the authoritative experts who have all the answers. What we're trying to do is really shift that paradigm, and it can be a very prickly endeavor, but it is really about acknowledging that paradigm, owning the trauma and harm that it caused to so many Native and Indigenous peoples and other peoples of color, and in many ways apologizing for it, and starting to try to find the path to work together in partnership with Native and Indigenous communities to grapple with this idea of ownership and all of these items that have come into our possession, often in very untoward ways and in circumstances where the playing field just wasn't level. And it was very much a colonized kind of process, and often a violent process that really stripped Native and Indigenous peoples of their human resources, their cultural resources, and kind of, you know, the museum industry claiming them for their own. So we have been going down that path as a staff, as a board, working with other institutions in the industry who are also trying to shine a light on a new ethics for cultural stewardship in the decades to come. And we're really honored to be trying to lead the way in that respect. It's not been without its challenges, but it's been with extraordinary rewards. And we're really excited about redefining and reimagining the role that museums play in our communities in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So with that, thank you. I'd love to turn it back over to Gail.
Okay. I'm watching the clock, and so I'm thinking, Mike, I might just ask a couple of the questions that we had considered. I think you did that. Thank you, by the way, for a very clear arc of explaining the change at your institution. how would you help someone listening understand the role of leadership in a transformational journey such as yours?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say, first of all, that as you all know, it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? That it is a journey that is constantly needing tending, like a garden where the alchemy is changing. You have to have the constituent parts that really set you up for success. In my case, we had a real sense of urgency that set that springboard in motion and justified a path that allowed those around us to support us engaging in some risk taking and doing some things that were real different, like building a half pipe in the museum, right? I would also say that, you know, embarking on a transformation like this really requires a true partnership with your board. That if those folks aren't fully supportive and engaged, and it's your role largely to educate them why this transformation is needed, how it's going to be implemented, what the end goals are. If you don't have that sort of support, you know, you're going to really end up in some hot water when those landmines inevitably get stepped in. Lastly, I think I would add, Gail, that you've also got to give that ownership over to the staff, right? While this started very much as my vision, it has evolved and become something different and greater than I ever imagined. And that was largely because others in the institution took ownership of it in partnership. And it also required a lot of letting go by me to sort of say, you know, it's not all about me, and let's check that ego, and let's come up, we're always going to be better together. And so that, you know, that's been a challenge, but also much needed and very much a rewarding part of the process.
Great. We could spend a whole hour on what you just laid on the table, but in the interest of time, and I'm seeing that questions are being asked of the people listening, what's the community's response been? I know you mentioned increased attendance, but can you give us a little bit of something to hold on to there?
Absolutely. And since we're all storytellers, I'll frame it that way. One of the things I'm most proud of among the many, many that we've accomplished is that I think whether it's the staff or the board or the community that's really engaged in what we're doing, they will say that being a part of this institution is not transactional, it is transformational. And to give you a quick example, one day I was in the race gallery and I was walking around. I saw an older woman who was there, and I went up and introduced myself. I said, may I ask you whether you liked the exhibit? She said, I loved it. My family and I are visiting from Wisconsin, and we've always been prejudiced against people of color. That's just how we were raised. And then she said, I'm 86 years old now, and I finally get it. Race just doesn't matter that much. God put people on this earth for the same opportunity, and they should have that opportunity. Thank you so much. And that is sort of the type of transformation, no matter who you are, that we want people to have. And we've got, you know, a whole archive of stories along those lines where we are really helping people see the best in each other, bring out the best in themselves. And in a time when, you know, we need to figure out ways to get along more than ever, you know, the museum can serve as a springboard for those kinds of conversations.
Okay. I have a feeling there'll be some other questions that'll spring up. All right, this is a classic question. Many people go, oh, you know, should we ever consider changing the mission? And I, of course, agree that from time to time that should happen. What is the situation for you? Are you thinking about it in any way?
Yeah, you know, that's a really interesting question that we have been thinking about. And I find it quite amazing that, you know, almost 8 years later here, our mission of inspiring human connections by exploring the human experience, in fact, has very much stood the test of time and is still feels as good in many ways. And, you know, any mission should, of course, capture that essence of an organization, but also have space to change and evolve on its own journey as the world changes around it. And it's responsive to that. In some ways, we are starting to think about a different iteration. And I think the evolution that we'll likely be engaging in the next year or two around our mission is keeping the inspiring human connections, but rather than broadly casting a net by exploring the human experience, by reframing almost from an equality to an equity focus, that we will inspire human connections by sharing alternative narratives that challenge people's assumptions and get them thinking in new and different ways.
Okay.
And Gail, I do want to say that we have a couple of questions. And so first of all, we just want to make sure we say thank you to both you and Micah. This has been a delightful conversation. We have an immediate question that says, what is the first place to start when thinking of changing a mission?
Okay, in the interest of time, that's a great question. I guess a short answer would be really getting a sense of the institutional readiness to look at it, and the commitment to dedicate the time to tackle a mission. It would require, in my mind, the commitment to do some research to understand issues happening in the community, and also institutional assessment. So I think it's a commitment and a readiness, and sometimes readiness is not there, even though the desire from some, like the director, may be there. But to Micah's point, if the board is not ready to take it on, it could be bumpy. And to whomever asked that question, I am happy to speak with you offline. Okay.
Gail, you also mentioned something around, earlier you mentioned something around holistic thinking. Have you found that that most institutions kind of isolate their mission and don't think about it as a part of their larger vision of the organizational work?
I'm afraid so, and that saddens me. I would say the search doing the research for the book, I certainly found examples of extraordinary leadership where the holistic nature was embraced. That also takes time to really dig into biases, assumptions, ways of working. Unfortunately, there are too few of those examples where from top to bottom, inside out, and I mean including the community, are in place. I would say Micah's institution is an excellent example. I would say some of the perspectives that you'll find in the book are also highlight some leaders that have really done extraordinary work.
And to that point, Micah, what impacts are you seeing in the community from your work? How do you see this actually changing the community? Or I think we might even rephrase that. How do we see that impacting the relationship that the Museum of Man has with the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll give a quick example. One of the things we've started to do as we've gone down the decolonizing path is that whenever we have a board gathering or a public program of significance, we will start with a land acknowledgement where we acknowledge the Kumeyaay as residing in this area since time immemorial, and that we're guests and visitors, and expressing gratitude to them. And we recently had a new trustee join the board. His name is Ricky Shabazz. He's the president of San Diego City College. And he joined in February, so it's only been less than a year. But our approach to decolonizing has really impacted him in many ways. And I heard the other day that when he was welcoming the crowd to the graduation ceremony at City College, he began in front of thousands of people, welcoming them and gave a land acknowledgement. I think it's a wonderful example of the impact that we're making, whether it's on the board or the staff or the visitors. Here was Ricky knowing he has an amazing platform to really get people thinking a little bit, and rather than sweeping the history of genocide under the rug, he started the event by saying, let's own that and thank the Kumeyaay, and now we can move on with our program.
Thank you for that example. I think that definitely speaks to you mentioned kind of the energy from the community earlier on in your talk, and I think that definitely speaks to that. So thank you, Margaret, for that question. Greg Stevens remarks that San Diego is his hometown, and he got an unofficial museum start at the Museum of Man. Very inspired by the work that you're doing, Micah, so thank you. Also, just hammering home the importance of the mission to the museum profession grad students at Seton Hall. The students sometimes are, not necessarily bought in, but I think Greg is emphasizing his insistence around mission relatedness. So is there a way that we can inspire those next generation of museum leaders and professionals to think about this work of mission and its relatedness? How can we inspire them to stay the course with the kind of exemplary work that we see happening? And I think Gail and Micah, if you both take a shot at that, just that one last piece of advice you have to our next generation, and then we'll wrap.
I'll start. I think, and I try to address this in the book, I think it's about thinking holistically and understanding the power of the mission and the vision, that is that future goal that you are aspiring to achieve, and really core values and organizational culture. That this generation that's coming up, I think I urge them to understand the power of that and how a holistic, interrelated institution works and how it relates to the community and takes a place of instigating change is really important. I sometimes worry that there's a lot of conversation about the latest exhibit technique. No, I don't mean to pick on you, Paul, but you know, or which is of course what my colleagues have expertise in, but it has to fit into the whole concept about what you're trying to achieve and the role of the institution that's envisioned through the mission. So Greg, thank you for your comments. You go and you make sure that your students have access and to understanding that this important role. Mike, I guess it's your turn.
Yeah, I mean, I would just briefly add that I think it's incumbent upon us to come up with amazing mission statements, you know, that are really inspiring to that next generation of leaders and to our staffs and to our community. And then finding ways of translating those amazing, inspiring mission statements into everything we do so that people see it becoming manifest. You know, the mission really, it has to be the springboard for everything else. And if you don't have something that is inspiring and really lights a fire under people, you're not going to be able to use it in the way that it should be used to permeate your DNA and create that springboard for everything else you do.
So with that, we want to say thank you to both Gail and Micah. This is our sincere gratitude from the museum group. We have deeply enjoyed this conversation. There's a couple of people in the chat who are giving you all both kudos, and I know that many more will go on to enjoy this conversation. You can stay connected with TMG by connecting with us on social media, both on Twitter and Facebook. And we hope that you stay connected with Gail. I'll repost the bit.ly link, and Micah has been kind enough to link the website for the Museum of Man as well. We just want to say thank you all, and we appreciate you. Thank you to those participants in the chat who stayed with us through the video as well. Look for the link on the TMG YouTube channel and stay connected with the museum group and all the good work they're doing throughout the year. Thank you all.